Hello everybody, I wanted to thank the organizers for inviting us all here. I think it's been a really productive and fun workshop. I want to tell you, well, I guess I should tell you who I am. I'm Jeff Clune, I'm from the University of Wyoming, and I there head the Evolving Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, which gives you a hint of why I'm interested in evolution, because I want it to re-evolve me, or you, or jaguars, hawks, and the human brain. And I'm going to tell you arguably some bad news, but I think it's at least interesting for the discussion that we've been having here. And these are two projects where I set out to try to get evolution to evolve evolvability. I wanted evolution to speed itself up and do something that would help produce complexity. And in both cases, I failed to get evolution to evolve evolvability. And in both cases, I found another way that we can get it to do it, but it's for non-adaptive reasons. So these are two papers that I've put together. One is on the evolution of mutation rates, and the other one is on the evolution of modularity. And usually there's completely separate topics, but at this conference I thought it was interesting that both of them had this property together. So I'll quickly tell you about them separately, and then I'll try to wrap up why I think there's some unifying themes. So the first paper is from PLOS Computational Biology. This is work that I did with Richard Lenski, Charles Afria, and some really clever Spanish scientists. And the conclusions are all in the title. And that is that natural selection fails to optimize mutation rates for long-term adaptation on rugged fitness landscapes. So there's a lot of caveats in there, and all of those are necessary. And I'll tell you generally the story. But the highest level summary of it is that natural selection, as we all know, is very short-sighted. And a non-low mutation rate is very, very good in the long term, but is very bad in the short term in terms of average fitness. And so evolution will always take the myopic route and be short-sighted and lower its mutation rate as long as it's on a rugged fitness landscape. So let me show you the evidence that I have for that. First, to motivate it, mutation rates we know are a key driver of evolvability. We've talked about that a lot here. And that raises the question of whether or not they are optimized for long-term adaptation. And I hope to convince you that they're not. So how do you do that experimentally? The general idea is no matter what the system is, the best experiment I could do is I could take a group of organisms, such as yeast, and I fix their mutation rate. I don't let it change over time. I let it evolve for a long period of time, and I record the final fitness, however I do that. So I'll plot that. So this mutation rate gave me this fitness. And then I'll take another group of yeast, and I'll raise their mutation rate a little bit, and then fix it, lock it in, let it evolve for a while, and evolve their final fitness, and plot that. And as you can expect, if you do that, there's probably going to be some intermediate mutation rate that is optimal for long-term adaptation. Okay? Then the question is, will evolution find it? So how do I do that? Well, I'll take a group of organisms that are up here at a high mutation rate, and I'll have a group of organisms that start with a low mutation rate, and now I'll let the mutation rate evolve, and then I'll find, do they converge on this optimum fitness rate, or do they go somewhere else? Now, Daniel gave a straw poll of all of us a while back, and a very few people said that they thought evolution would go down here, which implies either the people don't have an answer yet, or that they think that evolution would go here. So we'll see what happens in our experiments. So the system that we use to study this is AVITA, which some of you have heard about before. It's a computational evolution system. And if you don't want to get into the details of it, all you really need to know is that it's a system that's been well vetted. A lot of biologists have learned a lot from it and have cared what came out of it. And it's a population of self-replicating digital organisms on a very complicated fitness landscape. So I could spend hours telling you about the system and trying to convince you that it's interesting, but I don't have time for that today. So just take my word for it, if you will, that it's a complicated fitness landscape of self-replicating organisms. I will tell you a little bit about it, just so you have a picture. Each organism is a string, kind of like a Turing tape of computational instructions. They push numbers around, they pop numbers. They actually have to copy their own genome. That's the self-replication part. And then we asked them to do two different things. We asked them to, the faster they replicate, the more offspring they have, because there's limited space in the environment. And then they also have to get better at solving some tasks, some hard tasks. And what you see, this is a bird's eye view of this here. Fitness is on the, whoops, oh, that's annoying. Fitness is on the y-axis. And basically, fitness rises over time. So you can see these kind of selective sweeps. So somewhere in here, a mutation will happen that will raise fitness, and then you see it spread out in the population. And then on that backdrop with clonal interference, you'll also have other mutations come along in those genetic backgrounds, and slowly over time, fitness raises. And we've done a lot of work over decades in this system now, and we can tell you that it's a very complicated fitness landscape to navigate.
What are the axes?
So this is actually just space. So it's a spatial structured population, so you get born near your neighbors. And then fitness is on the other axis. So we don't give it one specific task in some sense. It's kind of more just that faster replication happens. But if you do tasks, you speed up. OK, so I know that that's a very, very light introduction to the model, because I don't think that the details of the model are too relevant, except that it's a complicated fitness landscape. So what happened? So if I fix the mutation rate to here on this log scale, and then I run evolution out for a period of time, then we get to a certain fitness. So with that mutation rate, my final fitness is up here, and then I go and I set my mutation rate to be this amount here, and the overall population ends up here. And I take the final fitnesses here of these fixed mutation rates, and I plot them, and we get this curve here, which means there is an intermediate optimal mutation rate in this system, and it's that. If you go too high, then you're above the, you start going back down in fitness, and too low, and you don't go very far. So then what do? We take a group of organisms that start here, above the, with a higher mutation rate than is optimal. Another group that starts with a really low mutation rate, actually they started here. And then I let them evolve. And what does evolution do with its own mutation rate? Well, what it does is it floors it. Passes right through the optimal zone and sets it to the orders of magnitude below what is optimal for long-term adaptation. And you can see the result in fitness here. So had they done the optimal mutation rate, they would have ended up here in fitness space. They end up down here in fitness on this log plot here. So I can show you that over time. Here we go. I'm going to, if I fix the mutation rate at the optimal, this is what fitness looks like over time. If I start high, I do get some adaptation, because while I'm trying to lower my mutation rate, while evolution is trying to lower mutation rate as fast as possible, I happen to get some adaptation. But once evolution accomplishes its goal of decreasing the mutation rate, then this is what happens to my adaptation over time. I shut it off. That's what evolution is wanting to do in this system. Now, interestingly, if I start with a very low mutation rate, it actually does go up a little bit, because I'm on the side of a fitness peak, and there's some low-hanging fruit around there, so I get some hitchhiking. And then it starts to go back down once I find a big enough peak that I'm surrounded by valleys, is my hypothesis. So, and this is the fitness over time. I do get some adaptation, and then I shut it off again. So, spoiler alert, if anybody here raises the fact that mutator alleles show up in experimental evolution populations, such as Rich Lynch's experiments, he and I think that this is what's going on there. You do get this raising, but it's still very, very, very much lower than the optimal long-term mutation rate. Yeah?
Does the mutation rate of the mutator allele itself evolve?
You can do that. I've tried that, and it doesn't make a difference. Basically, I'll show you the slide at the end. We tried everything you can think of, and there's nothing you can do to get rid of this result. Well, there's one thing, and I'll tell you what that is. So why does this happen? Well, I think most of the people in this room probably have a pretty good intuition, and that is because if I'm on a peak, this is our hypothesis, then the average fitness of an organism that has a very low mutation rate is the average of all the organisms that didn't move very far. They're all on the peak. That is a higher average fitness than this organism, which is putting many of its offspring down in the valley. Now, obviously, if I can jump the valley, if Y can put a thing over here, then we'll run up, but then we'll just repeat the problem over here. And so eventually, what happens is that X outcompetes Y. That's the supposition. Now, that was our hypothesis, so how can we test that hypothesis? Well, if it's the ruggedness of the fitness valley that matters, then I can test that by making a smooth fitness landscape. So I'm going to take this complicated Ovidian landscape, which I can't even map because it's too high dimensional and too complex, but I know has a lot of valleys, or at least I assume. And I'm going to just make it basically, put these organisms on the side of an infinite slope, and that slope has no valleys in it. So this is your simple counting one problems where you just want to have more and more and more ones. And then I can change the environment and go the other way and make them always on the side of a slope. Now, this one has no valleys. I can also add a valley by just saying, OK, an intermediate amount of these ones in this genome is bad. Right? With me? So what's going to happen? This is the answer. When I'm in a smooth fitness landscape, there are no fitness valleys. This is the optimal, the sweet. Stop that. I don't know why that happens.
You want to disconnect the wireless.
Okay, fair point. That's hard to do.
Yeah, it only happened once or twice more than that. It's hard to
So this is the optimal mutation right here, and evolution started high or low perfectly finds it. So on a smooth fitness landscape, evolution will optimize its mutation rate for long-term adaptation. Add in one little valley, evolution jumps right over it, doesn't even see it, still optimizes it. But as the valley size grows wider and wider, here and then here, then the result of evolution gets further and further away from the optimum, and the final fitness becomes orders of magnitude lower than the optimum.
Oh, so it doesn't cross.
This depends hugely on the population size.
Sure. My supposition, as we debated at lunch, is that if I increase the population size, I would increase the size of the valley at which it happens, but it will eventually happen. I just have to go down a few bars, view rows of my plot.
That's right, yeah. I mean, so the kind of the question is like the scaling. What's the scaling between those?
Sure, and all of your work you did yesterday is extremely related to it. If I can cross it in a short enough time that I can cross it before the selective sweep on the the advantageous lower mutation rate fixes, then I'm good. And if I fix before that happens, then I'm not good. But I want to point something out, because everybody thinks that, oh, it's just a matter of crossing time, and if as long as the valley is narrow enough and I can kind of consistently cross, then I'll be good. But I want to point out something that's even more insidious about this that makes the effect much, much stronger, and that is that it's a self-reinforcing process. So let's assume I'm walking along this fitness landscape, I come to this valley, and in the first generation, if I cross, I'm good. In the second generation, if the first generation, all my offspring are down in here, then there is now selective pressure for me to lower my mutation rate. Now, the lower mutation rate actually makes it even less likely that I'm going to cross the valley, because I've narrowed the band of mutations that I'm generating. So the whole time that I'm waiting for that lucky event to cross the valley, I'm actually exponentially, or whatever, it depends on the dynamics of the system, but I am decreasing rapidly the chance that I will then make the crossing. So if you ever find yourself in a natural fitness landscape, even if you're not on a perfect peak, but if you're on a functional peak, meaning that it's rare for you to generate some beneficial mutations, then you're going to start ratcheting down your mutation rate, making it even less likely you find those rare alleles, and the process quickly will drop your mutation rate rapidly. Yeah?
The only solution I think of is co-evolution of moving the valley.
Right. So you can, I mean, you have to, in this environment, I'm actually switching between these all the time. But you're running, and then you have to make this jump. So basically the question is, do you ever run into a situation where a very small fraction of your mutations are beneficial? And if so, in that environment, you're going to start lowering your mutation rate. So if you're always in a case where a huge fraction of mutation rates are beneficial, if you can construct that arms race for me, we're good. If not, we've got a problem.
So I mean, I think the idea is that, okay, you would start, you start lowering your mutation rate, but if the system is big enough, there's some weirdo somewhere who didn't realize that he was supposed to be lowering his mutation rate, and one of those will be the one that actually crosses the valley, and then they'll come sweep in and kick you out.
That's right. And in all of our experiments here, that's exactly what happens. Most of the population is dropping its rate. One happened to leave it high and cross the valley, and that's fine. But if you keep doing this for a long enough period of time, eventually that person doesn't get lucky enough soon enough that then the population is dropping the mutation rate, and then we're kind of in this lower space, and it becomes harder and harder to do that. So that game will work a few times, but all I have to do as the lowering advocate is win once, and then the game is over. You have to win every time we play.
So what is a learned helplessness effect?
He doesn't have to win. Somebody in the world has to win.
That's right.
Those are the only ones you see.
Well, I was just the lowering direct arrow, and he was the upward arrow. So he gets everyone in the population. But one of his players has to win every time. If ever I win, then it's not that the game is over, because you can re-evolve a high mutation rate. But you kind of see the net effect of this. Is that there's a whole lot of arrows pointing down on mutation rate, and it's harder and harder to construct arrows, I think, that prop it up.
But this is all where it crucially depends upon numbers. All kinds of numbers.
Yep, that's right. And so if we have an infinite population size, then this never happens. Yeah, I agree with you. So I think that what this at least does is it kind of fuels our intuition that it's probably harder to construct situations which evolution will optimize its long-term mutation rate than we originally thought before you did this work. I'm not saying you can't construct those situations. So here's the slide where the reviewers basically did what all of you guys are doing, which is, well, did you try this? Did you try this? What about this? This might be something that would work. And I actually know the reviewer is Chris Adami, and I've never had a reviewer put me through more rounds of requested experiments. There was like 7 of them. But we had to change the size of mutation rate changes, the frequency of changes. We had to make increases far more likely than decreases, because obviously in nature it's harder to evolve proofreading than to get rid of it. So you make this hugely asymmetric, doesn't make a difference. And we also critically we also made them self-reflexive, which actually makes it harder to decrease your rate.
What's self-reflexive?
Self-reflexive.
Where the mutation rate applies to itself.
Oh.
And why that's harder, I can tell you at the coffee break. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon, but it's not relevant. Yeah?
Actually has a name from it's called orthokinesis. Trying to understand why bacteria would set up gradients to a concentration of food. And it's just basically they're randomly diffusing, but the better the food is, the slower they go. And that curates concentration around the high food rate. So that's from the 1950s.
Okay, I'm not familiar with that. That sounds pretty cool. Okay, we also made them static versus changing for Chrysanthus' comment. The rate of change, the complexity of the environment, all these different things, different starting points. Basically, it's very, very hard. In fact, I challenge any of you, code up a situation in which evolution optimizes its mutation rate for long-term adaptation, and I will give you this half-drunk bottle of water. Yes. I don't have $1 million prize to give you. Yes? The complexity of these tasks, they're solving logic tasks. So there are simple logic tasks, or they're nested hierarchical logic tasks.
How did you do static versus changing?
We took the original Avita complex fitness landscape, which typically you evolve for 9 tasks. You reward 9 possible tasks. And instead I could reward 77. That's how I increase the complexity of the possible problems they could solve. But to do a changing, I randomly pick a subset of that 77, reward that for a while, and then I stop rewarding those and reward a different subset. And I can either make them jumping from different blocks, or I can make them slowly over-evolving, where one task stops being rewarded and I swap that in for a new one, so there's always something that's being rewarded across. Basically, do whatever you want. It's not going to work. I know you want it to work. I wanted it to work. I even tried, and I haven't published it, but I even tried group selection, lineage selection, because I thought that would be the answer. The downward pressure is so strong here that whatever upward pressure you can get from lineage selection just doesn't counteract. This is a very, very pernicious, insidious, strong downward pressure. And I'd love to fight it, but I haven't figured out a way.
Is it true that the Dami asked for all these and he didn't ask you to make the grid like 100 times bigger?
We did that too.
Okay, you did ask for that. That was in the...
I think we had already done that.
Did he ask you to do the extrapolation and estimate what numbers would be in some regime? Where
No, that's Daniel's job. Yeah. Okay.
Did you try a recombination?
We did. In fact, part of this work stems from the fact that we also wanted to figure out, my colleague Dule Misovic in the same lab with Lenski was trying to figure out when sex would evolve. That's another one that's very, very difficult. You try to give evolution the ability to turn on sex versus turn it off. There you can find narrow ranges in which it works, but they're pretty specialized. Okay, I want to get on to the other thing. But I like that everybody's kind of agitated, because it agitated me too. So the conclusion, I'll just restate the title, because now you'll understand all these words. Natural selection fails to optimize mutation rates for long-term adaptation on rugged fitness landscapes. In other words, natural selection is short-sighted, and I think that sounds obvious, but obviously people here even disagree with me. So I'd like to do Daniel's straw poll again at the end, maybe after I tell you this other result that I have. So the other result I want to tell you about, which I also think is pretty exciting, is this paper we just had out in Proceedings of the Royal Society called The Evolutionary Origins of Modularity. It's with Hod Lipson and Jean-Baptiste Moreau. And the general gist here, as most of you know, is that modularity is the encapsulation of function into units. So in a car, for example, you have a bunch of separate parts. In your brain, you have different scales of organization. You have different neural modules. And people basically, this is a huge driver of evolvability for the same reasons it is used in engineering, which is that you can recombine different building blocks to produce vastly different phenotypes using the information you've already discovered. And you can also tinker with within a module without having cascading epistatic effects throughout the rest of the phenotype. So it's usually a better system to design in. So for decades now, there's been a quest in the field of evolutionary algorithms to try to get evolution to start producing modular genomes. We want modular genomes, modular neural nets, modular phenotypes. We want it to use modularity because we think that's important. And if it could figure that out, then it's off to the races. But what's weird is that we can't get it to work. So almost every time that we try to evolve a genome network or a neural network, even if we give it an extremely modular problem, if we do everything we can think of, basically we almost always get this entangled spaghetti code. Everything gets wired to everything. Evolution does not produce submodules and then rewire them. It just doesn't happen in our simulations. So that's a question. Why did it happen? Why does it happen in nature? Why doesn't it happen in our simulation? So along come Cashton Cash and Allen in 2005, and they produce a hugely impactful paper which says that if you vary environments in just the right way on just the right problems, then you will get the evolution of modularity because that's a good idea, and then that speeds up evolution. The problem with that is that they had to work really hard for it, and if you re-implement the results, then you find that it's actually a pretty narrow parameter range in which that result happens. If you vary it in almost any way you can think of, then it stops working. So it was a really cool first result, but they're probably not the general force that got evolution to modularity to begin with. So we wanted to test a different hypothesis, which is that maybe it's not that modularity evolves because it's a good idea for adaptation. Maybe it evolves for some other reason, maybe because there are connection costs in networks. And this is actually a theory that was advocated by a founding, oops, that's on the next, no, it's not there. Oh yeah, here we go. Founded by, there was a hypothesis made in 1899 by Ramon E. Cajal, the famous neuroscientist, but he couldn't test it because he didn't know evolutionary algorithms or even computers. There are a lot of costs in biological networks. You actually just mentioned one that I love in genetic regulatory networks, but they're more clear in brains. You have the cost to build a connection, maintain it, etc. And so there's also evidence that selection acts to minimize the connection cost in a network. So if you look at something like C. elegans, for example, the placement of neurons actually is optimal to reduce the wiring cost of the neural network that it has in its body. And so the reason I wanted to test this hypothesis is, one, because we really want it in the field of evolutionary computation. We want to evolve complexity, but also because we want to answer this biological question of why modularity is ubiquitous in biological networks, but we don't see it in our own system. So why did it evolve in nature? So what we're going to do is we're going to take the problem from Cash and Allen's paper. This is an 8-pixel retina problem, so we have a little tiny retina, and we show it a whole bunch of patterns, and I'm going to ask it questions, and you tell me yes or no if you're going to answer this right or wrong. And the question is there an object on the left side and on the right side? So these are the patterns that count as a left object. These are the patterns that count as a right object. Half of the, there's some patterns I'm not showing you here that don't count. So I show you 8 pixels, and you tell me if there was a pattern on the left and the right. Was there this and this? Okay? Now, there's 2 ways you can solve this problem. One is that you just have one monolithic function that solves the problem. And the other one is you first figure out if there's a left and a right, and then you bring these things together. Okay? And they're both perfectly performing. You can solve the problem perfectly either way. So here is the entire paper in one slide. If you take this problem and you select just for evolutionary performance, which is what we've been doing in our field for 40 years for the most part, selecting for performance, you get an entangled network that perfectly solves the problem. If you select instead for performance and you penalize a connection cost, so you make it expensive, you have to pay for your connections, then you get extremely modular networks that decompose both parts of the problem. Now, what's really interesting is that if you then take these networks and you put them in a new environment, these networks are much more evolvable. They evolve much faster. So we did get evolvability from modularity, but the modularity did not evolve because of its evolvability. Yeah.
So I'm not sure I'm following. I believe that you have a huge trouble computationally understanding what is a module, identifying modules.
Yeah. So let me tell you how.
All I'm saying is that maybe one reason is because your way of finding modules is computationally. I'm not clear what the definitions are, or if it is necessary to have any. But
yeah, that's.
I think it's going to be computationally a very tough job to actually, for many reasonable definitions, to actually find modules inside your structure.
Okay, so I think the gist of your question is, how do you know that there aren't functional modules in these networks that you can't see because they don't pop out to your eye? So we tried to answer that question in 2 ways. The first one is that we use an algorithm that I didn't invent that can find modules in networks. And we had it split the network into 2, the best split into 2 modules. And then we saw the percent of time that the inputs relevant to the left side of the problem are in a different module than the inputs relevant to the right side of the problem. And we color those arbitrarily orange and blue, the 2 modules that the algorithm splits into. And what we find is that in most of the cases, 56% of the cases, in the treatment with a connection cost, you get that left-right decomposition of the problem. And you get it in I forget. I think you'd never get it in this treatment where you don't have a connection cost. So that's one way to probe if they are separating the problem into the left and right modules. And so it never happens here. It happens significantly more often here. The other way that we tested it is arguably maybe even a better way, which is that I can look at any neuron in the network, that neuron or this neuron, and I can just see, does it answer the left subproblem perfectly accurately? And is there another neuron that answers the right subproblem perfectly accurately? So I can tell if it's solving the two subproblems that are in this overall problem. And that significantly happens more often in these networks than these networks. I don't have the stat up here, but it's in the paper. So I think there's two reasons to believe that we honestly do have different functional decomposition into separate modules in these networks that we do not have in these networks. Now, let me show you a little bit more data also. This is modularity over time. So it raises in the connection cost treatment. It does not rise at all. This is what we've been wanting. For 40 years, we've been trying to construct problems to see that modularity would rise, and we've been seeing this flat line. If you add a connection cost, you suddenly see this huge improvement in modularity. Also interesting is that performance is actually better in the treatment with a connection cost. And this also drove the reviewers mad, because they said, well, if performance is better in the modular treatment, then why isn't evolution doing it on its own? Why do you need this connection cost? And the answer is because it's better over the long term. It's not always immediately better on the little peak that you're sitting on.
I thought you said that the performance loan ones evolved to solve the problem perfectly.
So you can get perfect solutions. Statistically, you get them much less often.
Right.
In fact, in this data here, which is when I evolved them in one environment and then switched to the other, I control for that by doing so many of these runs that I eventually get 50 perfect solutions. So I have 50 perfect of both, then I put them in the new environment, and these still evolve faster to avoid the confounding effect of starting off less. Okay, so you might ask why. If these perform better, then why doesn't selection evolve them? And so we invented a new algorithm to try to map out the space of phenotypes here. So I can show you cost versus modularity, and color is fitness. And I created an algorithm that would actually search through all different, for networks that have this combination of cost and modularity, this combination of cost and modularity. And then I want the best one at each point. So I can show you kind of a phenotypic fitness landscape, if you will. And what you can see is that there are perfectly performing networks throughout this space. So to some extent, this is also another reason why evolution doesn't have to go up here to a modular solution to solve the problem. And you can actually see over time that basically, if I want to keep my connection cost low and keep fitness high, which means stay in the yellow, then eventually I have to ride up this curve, and I end up here. So almost all of the connection cost treatment networks end up here, the modular solutions, which then are primed to evolve better in future environments, whereas the performance alone networks tend to stay down here. They don't get pushed into that space. So I told you about the evolvability experiments. They evolve faster. And then this is to compare the result with Cashton and Allen, which is the frequency of environmental change. Which means the Cashton and Allen result is this blue line here, which means that if you're in the right range of environmental change on the right problem, then you'll get their modularity. But as long as, once you kind of get out of the right range, then the modularity falls off. Whereas this connection cost kind of produces modular networks irrespective of the rate of environmental change. So it's a pretty general result. We tried it on different problems. You can see here 3 different problems, and you can see in every situation we've tried it on, and my lab's been working on this since, pretty much everywhere we try this, it works. Add a connection cost, and you'll get modular networks. And then the final thing I want to point out, which I was telling you about earlier today, is that it also helps with learning. So these networks here were just evolving networks, like a gene regulatory network. There's no Hebbian learning or anything going on. If I actually evolve neural networks, which are brains that are going to solve a problem, and I give them a learning algorithm, one open question in science is, how does a brain like yourself learn one task, and then when it switches to a new task, why doesn't it cannibalize that original knowledge? There's no remaining selection on that original problem. So natural animals, if you train them on one task, train them on a second task, they don't lose all of their ability to perform the original task. But all of the neural nets and neural network learning algorithms that we know about, if I train them on task A, it's going to rewire the network to solve task A really well. Then if I change to another task, that learning algorithm is immediately going to start changing the weights that encode the information that performed well on task A to solve task B. Now I'm good on task B, I've solved that problem, and now you put me back on task A, and I have to relearn it from scratch. It's not like I've learned both things in the network. The only way to have a network learn both things is to train on them simultaneously. So how do we solve that problem? If we can't solve that problem, then we can't evolve artificial intelligence that does anything interesting, because it'll always be a one-trick pony. So this critical thing turns out you can actually solve if you have a modular network. Why? Because when I'm learning task A, then I can consolidate all of my learning in module A. I have a module for that task. When I switch to task B, turn off learning in that module, turn it on in this other module, and learn everything in that task. And then when I switch back to this task, all I have to do is just use the other module, which has been sitting there the whole time. So the interaction between modularity and learning is actually extremely beneficial to being able to learn many different tasks without forgetting them when you learn new tasks. So the biological implications of this work, I think, are that it may be a major explanatory explanation for why biological networks are very modular. We're talking about protein-protein networks, genetic regulatory networks, neural networks, pretty much anything in biology. But I also think this is interesting for the evolvability people, which is that this connection cost may bootstrap evolvability explanations. Because if you think that modularity does give you evolvability, and that evolution might select for it, I still can't select for modularity until it starts giving me that payoff. So if I'm in an entire space, and over here in this dimension of modularity, here's where I'm going to start to get my evolvability payoff, but I start here, there's no gradient to evolvability until I get all the way to modular networks. Maybe the connection cost is what produces the modular networks to begin with, and then that can kind of hand it off to selection for evolvability, which can run off to the races with it. So it also, this helps us for evolving artificial intelligence. So this is my last slide, basically, which is that on two different problems we saw, both with mutation rates and with modularity, there was the option there for evolution to find a solution or a technique which would improve its long-term adaptability, and it didn't. And then I added a natural constraint from nature, either a cost for fidelity, for saying you can't have 0 mutation rates, you have to pay for that, or I add a cost for connections, and all of a sudden I flip evolution into a state where it's much more evolvable and it's much more adaptable. So it's evolvability in nature, but not because it evolved to be evolvable. And I'm not saying that that's always the case. It just makes me wonder how many other cases of evolvability that we see in nature arose for non-adaptive reasons, where we're searching for the adaptive explanation, but there's a non-adaptive one. Or the converse, which I'd love to hear this audience discuss in the discussion. How many examples of evolvability from nature do we actually have good reason to believe are adaptive? So I'd love to hear those examples. So with that, I'll just say thank you.
So your rugged participant landscape would be changing environment. If you included a reversible switch to the mutator, does that help?
Yeah, so effectively what you're saying is if you made it very, very likely you can go from a low mutation rate back to a high mutation rate.
Well, with some reversible rates, so you can allow mutators to sweep and then counter sweep, right, within the same string, within the same population, compete that against a population with a fixed rate.
Yeah, we did that, and the mutation rate still went down.
But still, I mean, in the optimum, right? Suppose they both went down, there would be one strain which still has a mutator available to it, right? Or do you just completely kill that?
What we do is we have a number on the genome, which is just the mutation rate,
Yeah.
and evolution can change that. So there's mutations to that number, and then selection does the rest. And I think to implement what I think you're suggesting is that what I want is that if I do lower over a period of time, once I get low, there should be the chance to jump up pretty fast, a big jump, and maybe even more frequent jumps high than low. If I implement both of those, it still goes down. It'll still sit on a peak. Does that implement what you're suggesting? Okay, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't understand it. Yeah?
I wonder if in eukaryotes they have an extraordinarily low per base mutation rate, but actually they have a lot of DNA. And so the effective mutation rate is much higher, simply because they've got so much DNA on which new binding sites could spontaneously arise. So, but we know that the forces that increase the length of DNA are very often non-adaptive and non-evolutionary. There tends to be upward pressure by, asymmetric crossover and
Transpose on
invasions and stuff on that. So this could be a very virtuous situation whereby the mechanism you describe, the per base mutation rate goes extremely low, but there are other mechanisms which force the whole genome to get larger, and so keep the effective mutation rate high.
Yeah, but also if a lot of that extra DNA is junk DNA, then those mutations really don't really matter.
Well, you can have a new binding site and here.
Yeah.
There's opportunities for that's just a thought.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing to think about. And I don't know if it's exactly related, but I think that somebody pointed this out a couple days ago. If you evolve genetic regulatory networks or genetic programming networks, then effectively they bloat their genome up. They make the genome extremely large, so that the effective mutation rate is lower because the percent of functional stuff in there gets much lower. Which is just a fact to throw out to consider.
Same in genetic programming.
What?
The same in genetic programming.
That's what I said just now. Yeah, GP. It's like bloat is a huge problem in that it happens all the time. Yeah, Dan.
So are the in the case with the two pattern recognizers, so are all the if I pick a random good solution with few edges, it's very likely to be modular?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
So I would think that kind of connected to the Valiant's idea is that if you started from really nothing, a huge number of instances where you start with nothing, and then you start randomly adding edges, then it would the ones that manage to find solutions would be much more likely to be modular.
Yeah, that's true, and you can do that in neural networks. You can start with no networks. You can let them be added over time. So it has to pass through this range of sparsity where maybe it will discover the solution. But again, it has to discover it in the short term. If you need to stay in that range in the long term, there's some local optima where evolution loves to make everything entangled because it kind of like is just hacking the best solution so far. It quickly overshoots the sparse range, puts itself into the highly overly complicated range, and then it's hosed in the long term. So this is why Richard earlier was mentioning my work in connection with his work. This natural cost for connections might be one reason that keeps the complexity of natural models and natural solutions low, which keeps them in the evolvable range. If there was no cost, then they would effectively add a lot of connections and overfit, and we wouldn't get evolvability and generalization. And so I think that it's very clear to show in our situations that property, starting simple and going more complex, won't solve the problem because they won't hang out in the good range long enough. They'll just overshoot, kind of like the mutation rate. It's almost the exact same as mutation rates. You can start high, sweep through the good space, but you're not going to stay there, and you'll overshoot to the low space.
So you're effectively doing regularization then on the networks?
Yeah, that's right. And that's where Richard's work in making the connections between the biological language and the machine learning language comes into play. Yes, a connection cost in nature might enforce regularization, not because it's a good idea, but because it happens to be the cost of physical connections. And that helps us evolve and create better solutions in the same way that it helps the machine learning.
Okay. And then have you seen Hinton's dropout algorithm?
I have.
So, I mean, that achieves the same kind of things that you do, except instead of costs, it's just noisy components, basically.
That's right.
Which seems to me much more biologically plausible.
That's right. And so for those of you in the audience that don't know what that is, Hinton has these giant deep belief neural networks. And what he does is they were overfitting and they weren't doing extremely well on problems. So he added noise to the neurons. So half the time they don't work, the hidden neurons. And all of a sudden performance generalization went through the roof. Everything starts performing better. So yet another example where something from nature, like the happenstance fact that things sometimes don't work, evolution probably didn't increase that error rate, happens to produce more generalization and more payoff. So maybe there's a third example of evolvability or generalization based on an accident of nature.
But then what again about this Daniel's argument you mentioned in the previous time?
Daniel Weissman or Daniel Fisher?
The Fisher one. That the ones we see, they just have to be evolvable in a way. Otherwise we couldn't see them today because they couldn't have managed to solve.
Yeah, so if you had an infinite population, and you looked in retrospect at which ones work, then I think that they would have a lot of these properties. They probably were ones that...
Even if this cost of connections wouldn't exist, you could only see the ones that by chance had evolved modularity, because otherwise...
If you saw any.
If you saw them, that's the thing. That's why I say with an infinite population. If you never got rid of the solutions that were not currently performing well, then eventually you might see these properties. But evolution has limited population sizes, and it gets rid of the stuff that's not working, and a lot of times it's getting rid of the stuff that ultimately would help it.
Or it's the question, how large is the population?
That's
You're
right.
saying the population is small.
Yeah, so at lunch, that was his answer. If you give me 10 to the 20th organisms and I'll solve this problem. And he may be right. That may be something that definitely factors in. It certainly doesn't help us who are trying to evolve AI.
To make the point in this byproduct picture, which I actually largely agree that a lot of examples in hindsight are interpreted as evolution of evolvability or just byproducts of something else. But maybe there's enough byproducts of something else actually to generate these things you need to evolve. And I think almost every example you look in depth, you find that. Just because it's kind of evolvability is kind of like a second order thing, exactly like you were saying. You need longer time scales, and every time there's going to be like a first order effect that has any effect on the evolution of that system. It's going to overwhelm that second order term, so it's just very difficult to get. So sometimes it seems like it because there was a first order thing there.
Right, but even if there is no such special cost, for instance, for extra connectivity, if you look in retrospect, it might look as if there is a cost for extra connectivity, but there isn't in fact. It was just selected by, because we see solutions, and the ones that we see, they have to have the structure, otherwise.
Yeah, but it could be noise, it could be changing environments, it could be, and all these things were actually like first order things. It could be just, error rates. If you look at I don't know, there's a ton of examples of this kind of thing.
Changing the mutation rate is also second order, right? So in other words, if you're reducing it, it's because you're reducing mutational flux.
Yeah.
Right? So deleterious mutations. So you are, in principle, able to select on such things.
Yeah, I just think the selection pressure is for the short-term effect of that second-order effect variable, and the short-term effect tends to be to disrupt information, which is exactly what we want in the long term, but in the short term that lowers my average fitness, and so I get rid of it. So there is selection on second-order stuff. It's just selection not for long-term evolvability. Yeah. Both.
What if you change the notion of short term? So like Bishop Watson was suggesting, if you make the environment switch between the two regimes more rapidly than the rate of evolution of the mutation factor.
Well, we tried that. That's not going to work. It is the case that if I ran the entire experiment, stopped, looked at what was the better of mutation rate, and did that, and then did that again over and over again. So I was always looking at the long-term effect and selecting on that. Then I can select for a good parameter. The problem is that evolution in the real world has to operate online unless it can do that. And that's actually what Richard Watson's work a lot is when can I kind of encapsulate off and try to look at the long-term timescales and not allow the short-term effects to sneak in and disrupt what I want to do in the long term. And if we can figure out mechanisms by which that happens in nature, then we've discovered the evolution of evolvability. Yeah.
So this is just a general comment, since the topic of evolvability is obviously coming up a lot during the conference. And so, I want to take a particular example, the problem of sexual recombination. So a lot of people see that as one example of the mechanism of evolvability, right? A lot of people ask what the benefits are and so on.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people think about it in terms of long-term evolvability, obviously. So now, if we think about what happens in nature, not necessarily in the simulation, but in case these two are not the same. There is a common tacit assumption that I think is often made, that we need to explain how sexual recombination evolved from an asexual world.
Yeah.
And then all these questions come up: the time scale, how should we explain it, by high-level selection, by modifier theory, and the cost of it, and so on. But it's also possible that it never evolved from an asexual world. It's also possible that as we go back in time, we see a world that has genetic exchange or exchange of hereditary material to as far back as there is something we call hereditary material, and that somehow this phenomenon has become formalized and over evolutionary time, which changes the nature of the question. So
Does it though? Because don't you have to explain its maintenance?
Yes, but then very interesting other ways arise of explaining its maintenance. In other words, it could possibly be, in a sense, part of the framework of life, and not something that evolved from a completely different world that didn't have it, in which case we need to solve those questions of when did it evolve from a world that didn't have anything like it, and how, and what are the costs and benefits, and how it's maintained. It's a different view, and as far as the evidence is concerned, it's completely possible. So we are, I just wanted to point out that we are making these massive assumptions that are very big, and that they can change our possibilities of how to handle questions of mobility. Things don't have to go the way of how did mechanisms of mobility evolve from a world that had nothing like that. That makes sense.
On that particular point, I think that's absolutely right. It makes a lot more sense to think about the evolution of chromosomes from an ancestral state that was replicators that were not linked. Right? So chromosomes and homologous recombination came later. Replicators that were unlinked came first.
Thank you. Appreciate it.